Forensic Science, and thank you very much for joining us today. We have three witnesses in front of us this morning. We have Dr. Marc Bailey, the Forensic Science Regulator, Gary Pugh, OBE, the former Forensic Science Regulator, who held the office until July this year, and Matt Gantley, the CEO of the UK Accreditation Service. Now, before we start, I'd just like to remind you that the session is being broadcast live on the net. A transcript of today's session will be sent to you in a few days' time for you to check and send in minor corrections. If there's anything that you do not say that you'd like to, or something you want to clarify, please feel free to contact the team after this. And if that's clear with you, then I'll start with the first question, which is this. This inquiry, as you know, is following up our 2019 inquiry, which recommended that the Forensic Science Regulator be given statutory powers. Now, this happened in 2021, and in 2023, the first statutory code of practice was published. Now, there's been much change in the forensic science landscape since this committee last conducted its inquiry and produced its report. Could you, by way of introduction, outline the changes that you've seen in forensic sciences in England and Wales since our last inquiry and the challenges that the sector currently faces? Previous regulators warned of a crisis. Are there signs of improvement? Can we ask Marc Bailey to...
Can I defer to Gary?
Okay, certainly.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes. I should point out that I retired in May 2018, so I wasn't around for your last report, I'm afraid. And I took up this post in May 2021, initially as the non-statutory regulator. I think the most useful thing I can do by way of setting out the changes and challenges is to perhaps very briefly set out the main basis on which the statutory regulation of forensic science works. And that falls under really four categories in terms of the provisions of the Act. There's obviously the code, the admissibility provisions, investigation and enforcement, and my broader powers under Section 9 to issue reports and give advice. These have resulted in significant change in the way that forensic science is regulated. And if I briefly go through those, because I think it will set the scene, I hope, reasonably well. On the Code of Practice, I won't dwell on the detail of that, but what is clear from the Act is that forensic science should be regulated as forensic science activities. And this is a theme that runs through the Act. It is not, if you like, forensic science as a whole. It recognises the broad range of science and technology that is used in forensic science for different purposes and in different ways. In the first statutory code, I defined 51 forensic science activities, 34 of which were subject to the code when it came into force in October 23, as you set out. And two further forensic science activities came under the code in October of this year. There were 15 that were not subject to the code when it came into force, and I think what was important to me was to set out the full scope of regulation. So, for example, one of the FSAs, one of the forensic science activities, is case review, which includes work for the defence and post-conviction review for the CCRC. It seemed to me important we send a clear signal this area was to be regulated, albeit we have not yet worked through specific regulatory requirements for that area. The code is largely based on the non-statutory code, or certainly on the underlying model, which I think is now pretty much globally accepted, that forensic science is based on an effective system working. So no one person generates a DNA profile, no one person determines the level of drugs in blood in a drugs driving case. This relies on a system working effectively. And that requires validation, demonstration of competence by the practitioners, documented and controlled procedures. I introduced into the code a requirement for there to be a senior accountable individual reflecting that accountability for a system rather than the very important individual responsibilities that forensic practitioners have in the criminal justice system, and particularly those who give expert evidence. So a senior accountable individual must be effective and committed to the leadership of a quality culture in an organisation and be accountable for the strategic leadership of the unit's compliance with the code and be accountable for risks related to FSAs. So that's broadly in terms of, I think, change what's in the code. The admissibility provisions, I think, again, bring a very significant change here. In the Act, it says the code is admissible in criminal proceedings, and a person who is not acting in accordance with the code, there can be an admissibility challenge. This is the route by which forensic science regulation gets into the courtroom, because that admissibility challenge is now set, if you like, in the Act. So what I did in the code was introduce the requirement for a binary declaration. You are either compliant with the code or you are not. If you are not compliant, you must set out the mitigating steps, and they reflect the underlying model. Is your method validated? Have you demonstrated competence? Do you have documented procedures? And so on. So that is the mechanism by which the courts can scrutinise whether quality standards have been met. And I think that's an important provision. We have seen admissibility challenges since the code came into force, but there have been relatively few. And I think that's due in part to, obviously, the backlogs in the criminal justice system. We have not yet seen admissibility challenges in that way become part, if you like, of the landscape in the criminal justice system. I think they will when the legal profession and others get their head around this and start to use, if you like, the admissibility provisions in that way. In doing that, I work very closely with the Criminal Procedure Rules Committee, who issue the criminal practice directions. So there is a alignment between what they say about reliability and requirements of disclosure and what's in the code. That, again, I think is really important. On investigation and enforcement, the provisions are interesting. They are not based on a simple compliance with the code. The regulator can conduct an investigation if they believe there may be a substantial risk to criminal investigations or proceedings. They can take enforcement action if they believe there is a substantial risk and issue a compliance notice. I think this is entirely right. A simple compliance is not the way to do it. We need to be focused on understanding risk. And the largest probably quality failure I dealt with while I was in office related to an organisation undertaking drugs driving analysis. My investigation into that and the outcome was that 1,700 prosecutions were rescinded. But that company was, on the face of it, compliant with the code and fully accredited. So forensic science is complex, and accreditation and compliance with the code are important, but there are still inherent risks in something as complex and as challenging as forensic science is. Traditionally, the investigation of incidents by the regulator has been very reactive. We wait for things to happen, if you like, and then we investigate them. What I did prior to the code coming into force was to take a more proactive approach. When I came into this role and I asked the question, who do I regulate? No one knows, or no one knew. There's no list, there's no register. We don't know who's undertaking forensic science activities. So I set about finding out, and I set about surveying those organisations to find out about their compliance to the code. This is the first time this had been done. And that proactive approach helps me understand, obviously, the risk that's out there in different forensic science activities. We did some data analysis and came up with an indicative compliance. And we found that of the 34 forensic science activities that were subject to the code when it came into force, 22 had high or very high compliance. There were some in the middle, and then there were 7 with low or very low compliance. So there was quite a variation across that. And I think that proactive approach to understanding risk, in the sense of prevention is better than cure, is the route that certainly I went down in terms of my approach to regulation. The final thing I would mention on enforcement, which has now come to the fore, and I've not seen it referred to before in this type of discussion, are the requirements under the Legislative and Regulatory Reform Act and the Regulator's Code produced by the government. And that code applies to me as a regulator. This has had a great interest recently, as you may have seen, in terms of regulators and regulation being scrutinised in relation to promoting economic growth. So it doesn't touch my core role, but nevertheless, there are some interesting targets in there, one of which, for example, is to reduce the administrative burden of regulation by 25% in this Parliament. So I would just lodge that regulators are influenced by other parts of government. I think finally then, just to keep this brief, I'm sure you'll want to explore these issues, is the final set of provisions in the Act under Section 9, which allows me to prepare guidance and reports and to give advice and assistance. It sort of says that the regulator can do anything apart from borrow money. And under those provisions, I have introduced and published reports. The significant ones, of course, are the 2 annual reports I produce, which I'm required to provide to the Secretary of State, who lays them before Parliament. Interestingly, the Secretary of State does not approve those reports, so perhaps I have a direct communication, or the regulator has a direct communication with Parliament. And in those 2 annual reports, you will find all of the information about the statutory consultation and compliance, and you will also find where I've highlighted areas that I think need to be addressed, where the legislation could be strengthened or improved, particularly around territorial extent and Crown bodies. I'll pause there because I'm conscious I've taken quite a long introduction.
Well,
thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that very full reply. It won't surprise you to find that you're already beginning to stray into some of the follow-up questions that we have in detail. So this is just, as I say, an introductory answer to the broad question that I put at the beginning, which is there have been these changes. And there are challenges. We've been warned of a crisis. What comments do you have to make? Now, Mr. Bailey, you are new to the role. What would you like to say by way of introduction?
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you for allowing me to defer. I felt it important that Mr. Pugh had a chance to give historical context. Coming in, I've been able to bring a fresh set of eyes. My background is not forensic science, but it is instead coming most recently from medicines regulation, where many of the scientific disciplines overlap, such as toxicology or DNA testing, biometrics. I also have a background in digital standards and digital standardization. So looking with fresh eyes, I was very pleased to see how actually we have a young but well-established regulatory framework. It is only really extremely young compared to the work in medicines, which is about coming up 30 years old, but has explored and used a lot of that learning to set up the basic principles. So coming into place, I'm most engaged at first in understanding the area. And so I've been going out to forces and talking directly to practitioners, both in companies and others, to understand how the code, the accreditation and everything looks like from the people who are actually dealing with this day in, day out. What you'd expect is a large complaint about bureaucracy. But what I've been really struck by is the sheer enthusiasm. The policing are absolutely motivated for helping the victims of crime, and that comes through, and they are pushing for a change as they see to make sure it works. So I know that there's a lot to do to grow this young regulatory framework into a mature one, some of which have been listed already, but I'm looking forward to driving that forward. Now, in terms of specifics, in the past 4 months, there have been various of the forensic science activities which have needed corrective work and the ongoing investigations, which I'll talk about. I just want to highlight the interface with the criminal justice system. The Act states that the regulator regulates the forensic science practitioners through forensic science activities, but provides information to support the criminal justice system. Now, that information, of course, is the code, but it's also a declaration of compliance. And that has highlighted a real interface question, which is a declaration of compliance as defined by the police has proven not to be the same as a declaration of compliance as defined by the law. And we've been doing a lot of work of crossing that boundary to come up with language that the police can write and understand and the courts can use. And I think that's going to be very important to consider the impact in the criminal justice system of any changes to the forensic services. I'll pause there.
Thank you very much indeed. Mr. Gantley.
Thank you.
You've heard the question twice. Please feel free to introduce yourself and make your first attempt at answering it.
Thank you very much. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Marc. I'm the Chief Executive of UKAS. I've been the CEO of UKAS for just over 7 years. My background is in conformity assessment. I spent 25 years in different organisations involved in testing, inspection and certification. If I can, I just want to give a very brief overview of the work and the remit and the scope of UKAS, and then come to the key questions relating to changes in the period of time since the last committee hearings. So UKAS is the United Kingdom Accreditation service. Our role is to ensure that conformity assessment bodies undertake their activities in a competent, impartial and consistently reliable way, particularly focused on those aspects of international standards or relevant requirements such as the Forensic Science Code of Practice. Those conformity assessment bodies are very broad in nature. They include testing, inspection, certification, calibration, validation and verification. They do sound like the same thing, but they do have very precise meanings in terms of scientific discipline and the methodology of quality assurance for those aspects of conformity assessment. And those disciplines are clearly defined in relevant international standards, European standards or British standards. UKAS doesn't define those standards. We ensure that those conformity assessment bodies fulfill those requirements. And a key specific requirement relating to forensic science is compliance with the Forensic Science Code of Practice. So that's the primary objective of the work that we do as an accreditation body, ensuring that the conformity assessment body meets the requirements of the relevant international standards, but also meets the relevant requirements of the Forensic Science Code of Practice. We are a not-for-profit, non-profit distributing organisation. The model of accreditation is self-financing in the way that we don't receive government funds for the accreditation activity. That's entirely financed through the accreditation fees that we charge for those accredited entities. In its broader sense, UKAS delivers around 38,000 assessment days per year. We accredit around 3,000 accreditations. That includes 2,500 organisations in the UK and abroad, but specifically in relation to the forensic science section, it's around 92 organisations, and we've got 10 organisations going through the process of application. We're a company limited by guarantee. We don't have shareholders. We're not non-profit distributing. We have 26 guarantor members, and they include members of departments of government, ministries, for example, the Ministry of Defence, the Department of Health and Social Care, the Department of Business and Trade, as well as professional groups and users of accredited conformity assessment. I need to be clear that we're not a regulator. We support the work of the Forensic Science Regulator. So what's changed? So in that period of time, the numbers of accreditations have increased. Since the period of 2020 to date, the number of accredited bodies has gone from 71 to 92. We also evaluated as part of that process compliance against the code. Gary's highlighted the critical importance of that. And the percentage compliance level hasn't changed significantly. It's gone from 68 to 67% of those accredited organisations. We see that in the traditional areas of conformity assessment or forensic science activity, particularly relating to those areas covered by traditional scientific evidence such as physical and chemical analysis. For example, bloodstain pattern analysis, handwriting analysis, body fluid identification and DNA recovery. They are well-established areas of accredited conformity assessment. But what we've seen is a challenge in terms of achieving compliance to the code as well as achieving accreditation is incident scene examination. And also the lowest levels of compliance are particularly in the areas of digital forensics, data capture, processing, analysis and digital storage devices. That's where we've seen the lowest levels of compliance. That's where there is the greatest priority to address the challenges of those organisations reaching compliance with the code and reaching accreditation. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, now look, we have a committee bursting with questions and we're going to cover a lot of areas. And can I now invite Lord Burnett to put the next question?
Perhaps I should first declare an interest, or at least a past interest, as Lord Chief Justice. I was responsible for the new criminal practice direction, which included quite a lot on forensic science and much else, and also the criminal procedure rules, which were revised quite substantially concerning forensic science. But my question really, primarily to the two regulators, is how have the new statutory powers under the Act and the 2023 Code changed your ability to ensure quality in forensic science? And I think we'd quite like to have some examples of where improvements have flowed from both the Act and the Code, and also the challenges you've faced. And I think, Mr. Pugh, you mentioned a challenge over the drug driving cases and the fact that the provider appeared to be in compliance with everything, but it was a really big issue at the time. And what challenges do you have in enforcing the code? And more broadly, do you think the powers that you have are adequate to do the job that you're required to do? So again, if you choose who goes first and who goes after.
I go first? Okay. Thank you. I think that my sort of starting point in this was that I had to get the code written and approved and through the processes that it's required to go through in order for it to come into force to get people's attention. So that took 2 years from the day I arrived to Parliament, both houses of Parliament approving it. It clearly caused a change in the culture and outlook of all of the providers. And I think they, if they'd not taken notice before, then they started to. Some of them started too late, and of course, as Matt has outlined, we are now still seeing that there are organisations that are not compliant with the code. But what we did in the compliance survey was to look at whether or not they had the structures in place. So have they validated their methods? Did they have a demonstration, a means of their practitioners demonstrating competence? And in general, we found that those that work, if you like, was well in hand. So there was risk mitigation there in the system. The accreditation will come, obviously, when an organisation has a track record and can be assessed by UKAS. What I wanted to know was, are people on track to do this? And I think the Act and the Code spurred organisations to do that. Having said that, we have some problem areas, and Matt has touched on that, particularly in digital. And in that area, it's interesting, we first went out and asked about compliance, and we got a response, and particularly within police forces, there were digital forensic units who had embraced, if you like, the regulation and were progressing towards that. Interestingly, in their response to the survey, they responded back telling us where they were and whether they were compliant. But they also made reference to the fact there were other people in the police force who weren't taking any notice at all. So the next time I wrote out, it was very good of them to do that. I wasn't expecting them to tell a regulator that, but the next time I wrote out, I wrote to the senior accountable individual saying, I want to know about everyone who's doing this. So we flush out all of the units. And I think the end product of that was that actually overall compliance went down, because now we got visibility of all of the units in police forces who are undertaking digital forensic work. And I think this is massively challenging because of the scale of it. In forensics, even DNA profiling is small compared to the scale and impact that digital forensics will have. And I think we've got some real challenges there because of the organisational structures and the multiplicity of organisations that are involved. I also made reference in the annual report, I think at the time I wrote the first report, there were 59 organisations. They are all independently validating methods and developing competency frameworks. So I was really responding to the criticism that forensic science is very, regulation is very bureaucratic and so on. Well, we seem to be investing a lot of time and energy in doing things many times over. So you will see in our report that there have been improvements. I mean, Matt touched on them in terms of compliance in the lowest forensic science activities. Not all organisations are there yet, but I think my primary focus in that first 2 or 3 years was to understand the risks, because the risk is the basis on which I can use the enforcement powers in the Act. And you will see in the second annual report how we approach some particularly challenging areas in an FSA that has the lowest compliance, and this was determining speed from CCTV footage, which turned out to be a significant and major investigation, which I passed on to Marc when he took over. The interesting thing there was when I wrote out to organisations to highlight those risks, 15 police organisations immediately stopped doing that work. So I think we are having an impact. I won't pretend we've got there yet, as Marc says. This is not fully bedded in business as usual, but we are having that impact. And if I can just go back to perhaps your background, I think we haven't seen yet in the criminal justice system the use of the admissibility challenges. And I think when that starts to happen, what the judiciary tell me is, well, we need to see what happens in the Court of Appeal, Gary, from their perspective. But we will, I think we will see that, and that will really bring home to people the potential impact of not complying with the code. And I think that's the right way to do it.
Could I just follow up on the example you gave about determining speed from CCTV footage? I mean, it sounds like a niche thing, but it's actually quite widespread. Having learned that, I think you said 15 police forces immediately stopped doing it, are you aware of any follow-through to look at the cases in which they had been doing it and where the evidence had been admitted?
Yes, I mean, part of my response was to those organisations that stopped doing it is you now need to review all of the previous cases in which you've undertaken this, which they did. So clearly there's potential legacy there of cases that may be unreliable, but that was tasked to the relevant police forces. And I think it's also the area that when I was regulator, it was the first area that we used the powers under Section 5, the investigative powers to require information. But this has become a very large scale investigation for the regulator. And what I will also say I did very early on, recognising the way the Act is constructed, was to produce some detailed guidance for the criminal justice system, so that it didn't go down very well in some quarters, but I basically set out what all of the potential risks were, so that a barrister or the courts could understand what the risks were and why this type of examination could go wrong, or where it could go wrong.
Yes, thank you. Bailey, Dr. Bailey, anything to add to that?
Just to say, to take for the investigation over speed, Gary pointed out what had been done about police forces. What happened is that a large number of the ongoing cases by those forces were taken up by other forces, but also the private sector. The investigation has continued to look at the private sector and look to see what is the level. And we have got additional levels of compliance information out of the private sector to understand how they're doing in comparison to the police. And there is a range, and we're then thinking about how we deal with the ones at the lowest level of the range, how to raise up their performance so that we avoid what risks being a postcode lottery on speed investigation. Another feature that we've worked on is very much interpretation. So at the moment you have forensic science. We are putting forward guidance on effectively how you interpret it. So how likely is it, for instance, that somebody had left their DNA in their place when you have conflicting evidence and so forth. That interpretation has been extremely well supported and has another example of really good feedback from the criminal justice system as well as the policing, and we're hoping to publish that in January, which should then clarify and bring consistency over a whole range of cases using forensic evidence.
And just the last part of my original question, are the statutory powers adequate for you to do what's expected of you?
The statutory powers are adequate. They're really quite free-ranging. There are a couple of additional ones I would like from comparison with medicines, but their absence is not a barrier. So the two I would like is possibly more formal recognition of inspection powers by the regulator. And also I'd look to see about penalties. There's been a huge amount of work, and thank you for the work on the Criminal Practice Directive, But I'm looking to see if there cannot be some kind of scale of penalties reflecting of the size of the organisation is delivering, so that it's not a one penalty for all and a large organisation could shrug it off.
Thank you. Mr. Gantley, anything to add on this particular question?
Not on that particular point. Regulation is not our role. Thank you.
Thank you. Baroness Northover.
Well, that's my questions follow on from what we've just heard, actually, and the two questions focus on sort of the gathering of information and the resources to do the work you're doing. The first one is, how do you become aware that a forensic science provider is not complying with the code, and is that all through surveys and reports, and can you do inspections? And Dr. Bailey has just made reference to that. And so do you in particular feel that you get sufficient access to in-house provision by the police? Can I turn maybe to Mr. Pugh first and then to Dr. Bailey as to what he feels now needs to be done?
I think the simple answer is we do get made aware of issues, and this has actually been a feature of the regulator's role since its inception. There is a requirement in the code to report what we call non-conformances. So any individual or organisation that's undertaking forensic science activities, regardless of whether they're compliant with the code makes this requirement to tell us about stuff that is going to impact on criminal investigations or proceedings. So there is a requirement for a reporting mechanism there. The current level of referrals, as we call them, is running at about 2 a week, so there's sort of just over 100 a year. The interesting thing about that is most of those are actually people telling us about things that have gone wrong. And what I've said many times, that generally in forensic science we have a strong and healthy culture of self-referral. The case I referred to, the investigation I referred to with drug driving, that came to us as a referral from the company, and likewise we get many notifications like that. Some of them are relatively minor, but it allows us to assess the risk. So we have got, I think, a good culture, and I think that's to be supported, what I might call the airline pilot culture. And I encourage that. We also have an anonymous reporting line, but I think probably what is not seen, and certainly even though I've had a long career in forensic science, I didn't realise this until I got into this role. One of the key sources of information about things that are not going well, or potentially there is unreliable evidence, are the defence experts. And the defence sector is critical, because they will see close up, in detail, what organisations are doing through the criminal justice system. And that reporting route to the regulator, and I say I've given an example, there actually are many others where it's one individual who's a defence expert revealing or finding problems. Sometimes they don't affect the particular case that's at trial, but they indicate that underneath the organisation is not following the code, or they are certainly creating risk.
And clearly coming out of medicines regulation, Dr. Bailey, could you comment on what you feel is now required in terms of being able to inspect as opposed to waiting for these reports to come in?
Certainly. So just to make a slight correction, we're now seeing referrals at the rate of 3 to 4 a week rather than 1 to 2. Sorry to correct Gary, but what's changed there, which is very pleasing, is it's the culture of near miss. We're not seeing referrals that are purely it's gone wrong, but we've almost made a mistake, and we've put in place this mitigation. Can we, and yes, does the regulator approve? So some of these referrals are becoming quite rapid to deal with, and I absolutely welcome the culture of near miss. It's important in many regulatory systems. It's better to know, because then we can disseminate that best practice. To add to Gary's list, we also are seeing more information coming through the expert groups. The regulator has a power to convene expert groups to get real expert opinion on what a regulation would look like. These are made up of both practitioners, but also, say, academic experts, defence experts. It really just depends on the topic. And they've also proven to be a very good information gathering system. And so we're beginning to see some stuff going through with leads for us to then ask and inquire beyond. In terms of inspections, we of course do have the UKAS inspection system, and Matt here can talk about, say, the powers of unannounced inspections. My team performed its first inspection, to my knowledge, in the latter half of this year. We were looking at part of an investigation, and we felt it was necessary to go in. It was notable that we received full and complete cooperation. So, unlike medicine, it's not a formal inspective structure that lies with UKAS. It's more proving to be an informal one, which I intend to use as and when is necessary, and that's extremely useful. And finally, I just want to really emphasise letters as well. We get letters from the victims of crime, who have got the closest input on maybe not the technical detail of forensic science evidence, but certainly the impact. And those are also leading some really generate some very important leads.
And, any further comments?
Thank you. Yes, in the interest of brevity, I agree with all of the points that Gary Pugh and Marc Bailey have already highlighted. I welcome also the recognition that's given to the number of quality incidents that are now coming through, because they do indicate a culture of learning, a quality improvement. We want those near misses, we want those smaller incidents to come through so we can identify the trends overall for a particular conformity assessment body, forensic science provider, and then overall within the sector itself. So that's a very healthy culture to see in any different sector, and we see that in aerospace, automotive and other areas. We want the practitioners to flag those issues for them to be able to resolve themselves directly. There's also a mechanism where there's a significant non-conforming work, where it's not just relevant to that particular forensic science provider. It may be more of a question relating to the test methodology, or have implications more broadly across other forensic science providers, and we've changed the mechanism for reporting from the forensic science provider to UKAS and the customer agreement to allow that mechanism to happen, and we do a risk-based evaluation. We meet with the forensic science regulator on a weekly basis to understand all of those quality reports that are coming through in order to identify trends and make sure that they are appropriately closed off. I wanted to quickly highlight the process of UKAS accreditation and our assessment program. So we assess initially the forensic science provider to see if they meet the relevant requirements of the international standard, as well as the code of practice for forensic science providers. So we assess that initially. If they meet all of those requirements, we then grant accreditation, and then there's a process of surveillance assessments every year, as well as in the fourth year a full reassessment of the whole system again. So there's an ongoing process of evaluation. In addition, as Marc has highlighted, if there are complaints or a whistleblower, or we have issues raised to us confidentially and directly, we have the right to go and do an unannounced visit of the laboratory or the police forensic science provider to understand what is going on site. Or, as Gary's highlighted, if there are specific issues that come through significant non-conforming work or that have been highlighted to us from defence experts, we will fully investigate that at the next assessment or through an unannounced approach.
There is that element. So coming to the resources, now I understand that the Forensic Science Regulator's latest annual report notes a staff of 8.4 full-time equivalents, members of staff, and a budget of under 800,000 a year. And do you feel that this is sufficient for you to fulfil your functions? And in terms of just realistically, ideally, what would you like to see? And if I can again take Mr. Pugh first.
Okay, I think I'll let Marc answer on the detail, because clearly he's now the regulator. A general comment I would make, in the Act, there is, I think, a fairly standard provision that the Secretary of State, following consultation with the regulator, will give the regulator resources. I must admit, what I didn't find in the Home Office is a process to do that. And in fact, interestingly, I discovered that as a statutory role holder, and I'm probably showing myself up here, I should have a framework agreement between me and the Permanent Secretary. I didn't have one. And I worked with the Home Office. We found the template and we produced it. And when I left, it was sitting with the Treasury. This is still not published. You may find that useful because it not only sets out my relationship with the Home Office, but with the Ministry of Justice and the Department of Business and Trade. But it also covers off how resources are allocated. And I think, I feel I've let Marc down because we didn't have a process where someone, and I'm not expecting the Home Secretary obviously, but someone at a senior level would talk through what the requirements were for the regulator and whether or not those resources could be made available. But I think now Marc's dealing with the practicalities. I'll hand over to him.
Thank you very much. Just to start with the framework agreement, sadly it's still waiting to be delivered, and I would really like to encourage the Home Office to progress this, because I came from the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, where the framework agreement was a key part of monitoring the effectiveness of the relationship between, in that case, an arm's length body and the government. So we do need this. It will set some powers. Now, moving on to this year, the annual report is 23-24. I've since had an increase in funding by roughly about 20%. So I now have a team of 14 people and an increase in operating budget. So I'm very grateful to the Home Office for that. However, I would still like to hold out for more resources because, first of all, would you expect anything else? But why? As I mentioned, with that new staff, I was able to run a focused inspection this year, which enables to get to the heart of it. If I had more resources, I could do this more effectively. I'd also, from the framework, understand a budget for investigations. I'm currently in negotiation to how best to complete an investigation, where I'm trying to get funding from the Home Office for an extraordinary measure. I don't wish to disclose it would go into the investigation, but nevertheless, there isn't a structured mechanism for me to do that. It would also, of course, enable more FSAs to bring in line with the code. Gary mentioned that there are 51 recognised forensic science of activities. Why are there only 34 in the code? It's purely amount of time and resource. The missing resource, it would be used to get the experts in place to set up the standards, which enables us to bring all of forensics up rather than selective areas. Another key area I would really seek support on is information technology. So for the first time this year, we had an IT portal, and again, thank you for the Home Office, which enabled all of the policing and other forensic science practitioners to submit data on their declarations and their compliance. As a first time, it had a lot of teething problems, and it's also only a step in the right direction. Coming from another regulator, these portals were essential for bringing efficiency savings to the people you regulate, as well as to the regulator. And so a lot of concerns have been raised with the regulator about the difficulty of using the current version of the portal. More support on the portal, more integration would actually enable that to enable policing to prove their compliance so much more effectively, the FSPs as well. And I think that I could go on, but I think that's a good place to stop.
Thank you.
Thank you. Baroness Young has a quick follow-up question.
So I'm slightly confused at the difference between inspections by the regulator and inspections by UKAS.
Under Section 9 of the FSA Act, I have the right to take measures to understand any non-compliances. Now that includes not a formal inspection. I called it inspection, but it was probably closer to a structured visit where we went and actually questioned. It was designed specifically for that investigation. It doesn't represent a power that I necessarily adopt because it was required in a certain period of time rather than a structured process. Matt's and the UKAS has a much more structured process, which you can elaborate on.
Thank you. So I think I highlighted earlier that the UKAS assessment process is based on, first of all, an initial assessment. So we gather information together submitted by the forensic science provider on their compliance against the relevant standards and the code. We gather all that information together, then we undertake an evaluation on site, as well as some aspects that are done remotely. We then determine whether they, through an evaluation of the practices and procedures, and in practice the activities that are undertaken under the forensic science provision, whether they've met those relevant requirements, and then we potentially grant accreditation. We also raise findings during that process itself for the forensic science provider to address. If they've met all those requirements, we grant accreditation. And then there's an annual surveillance assessment, and then every 4 years there is a full re-evaluation called a reassessment. As I've highlighted earlier, there's also the ability for, if there is a whistleblower or a specific incident that is highlighted to us or brought to attention, or, for example, on the Commission of the Forensic Science Regulator, we will undertake an unannounced visit or increase the number, the frequency of assessment of that forensic science provider. So ours is a process of ongoing evaluation as part of accreditation, and that model I've just described is repeated by other accreditation bodies internationally.
Thank you. Now we must move on because time is pressing, and I hope questions and answers can be a bit shorter. Baroness Walmsley.
Thank you. My question is about compliance with the code. I was intrigued by your emphasis on a near-miss culture earlier. If you walk around this building, you'll see a lot of posters saying report accidents, but also report near misses. So it's interesting to see how important that is in your field as well. But my question is, are forensic providers in England and Wales generally on track to meet the code standards, or are there still significant gaps? And I noticed that you told us earlier that 22 out of the 34 organisations came quite a high score, but about 7 were low or very low. So I wonder if we can dig into that a little more and see if you can give us an indication of the areas of the code where compliance is generally good and where it's generally lacking, and perhaps some examples. And are there differences in compliance depending on the provider? I noticed that one of you said that there is a range amongst different kinds of providers, and I wonder if we could have perhaps a summary of that work that after this event. That would be helpful.
I think that as I did the survey and provide the information, if I start, sorry if I misled you, when I said 22 out of 34, that is forensic science activities which have high or very high compliance.
Right, so not the organisations. But I see.
It may be worth me saying that when we did the survey, we found that, and we hunted out, if you like, the organisations who are undertaking forensic science activities that are subject to code. That first survey identified 77 organisations. So that's a combination of police and commercial. To go to the different levels, or perhaps the low compliance areas, say there were 7 in the low and very low, and perhaps if I go through the 4 that were very low, you'll see in the annual report I give an assessment of risk, and even where there was low compliance, what we did was we got underneath that to see whether or not organisations had the structures in place to manage quality, whether they had made applications to UKAS to gain assessment. It's important to remember that the UKAS assessment, in a sense, comes at the end. There's a lot of good work UKAS can do to support organisations, but achieving accreditation comes after you've got a proven track record and UKAS have assessed you. So there are a lot of people in the process, if you like, of doing that, and it's a multi-stage process. So we wanted to find out where they were. Organisations that had not validated their methods, their staff weren't competent, and hadn't got a clue. They were very few and far between, and we obviously targeted those first. But generally, I think because this has been around for quite a long while, there hasn't been an impetus to move it quickly, but organisations had started down that road, and that's what we saw when we got underneath it. if I go through, without making the answer too long, and please stop me if I am, but if I go through the four, if you like, we're at the bottom of the league, and this is interesting because if I just deal with two of them, which actually were the routine, this is, again, where there isn't an accreditation requirement, we dealt with this differently. And this does relate to the routine, simple, if I put it that way, collection of CCTV footage and audio. Now, the way that that was set up, certainly prior to my arrival, was that the police service, the NPCC, developed a framework with the regulator which set out the standards and the training that was required. Because now we're looking not at forensic experts, we're looking at frontline officers. But nevertheless, it's important they get it right. Otherwise, all of that hard work and scientific interpretation that happens down the line is for nothing if they don't collect it in the first place, or they don't collect it at all. So what the code did was make the framework, if you like, the compliance mechanism. The police service might not thank me for this, but they shot themselves in the foot rather, because when we went out and did the survey, as good as the framework is, what the responses we got from the police forces was they didn't actually understand their own framework. So we ended up with a very low compliance. The Assistant Chief Constable who leads this and who developed that framework, an ACC from South Wales Police, was obviously aghast at this. And we worked with her then to make it very clear that because this was a compliance mechanism in the code and the FSA was subject to the code, that engaged my powers of enforcement. And what happened, the upshot of that was when we then, in the second annual report, we'd made that very clear, there was then a large increase in compliance. And in fact, over 70,000 police officers have now met the requirements in the framework. So there has been a positive effect from that, albeit the starting point was not a good one. That leaves two other forensic science activities. One I've already touched on, which is digital. And I think the challenge here is not only that we've now got not just one organisation, but a multiplicity of organisations or units within police forces and an increasing number of commercial providers. So this is growing at a fast pace, not just in terms of the number of organisations. So it is challenging, and certainly in my time, particularly challenging. What I think we also need to think about, of course, is that because this is going to be so big, this is not going to be like a traditional forensic science discipline. The recovery of data is going to be a core competence of every detective. So we need to find a way to regulate the front line. Accreditation would be too onerous. We couldn't put every investigator through that same process. So when I left, we were in discussions. I think you heard evidence from Jane Mayer, who is the digital lead. And we need to develop an operating model here, I think, which is tiered so that we can manage risk. So those officers in the front line can get access simply to data they need to progress the investigation. But if it's deleted data or it's more complex, then it goes to different levels of unit. They will require a different regulatory solution.
So does that mean that that you look at the quality of the training and the courses that frontline officers have?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think the key is that what it needs within the police organisation, and when I wrote out to get further information on this from them, I asked for a nominated lead for the whole police force. Now, again, most police forces were fine with that because the technical specialists in the central unit oversee what's going on. In some other forces, it wasn't. And there was clearly internal tensions, even to the point of people asking me, well, we'll give you the information, but don't tell that other unit in our police force. So I think, there are some real issues here that need to be addressed, not for the regulator, I'm glad to say. But and the HMI, I think this may be mentioned as well, they made a recommendation that all of the digital forensic activity should come under, if you like, the forensic unit so that you adopt that forensic culture. That hasn't happened. There are many forces still resistant to that. So I think we've got a lot of complexity here. We need to get the right proportional solution based on the risk. And if I'm honest with you, I think we will see some incremental improvements, and certainly the central units will comply with the code, but we have a larger number then of individuals, practitioners who will need to somehow come under regulation.
Thank you. So we have been hearing how very complex the whole system is, and I think we've come to the conclusion that the whole system is really important, that it all works together, from incident scene investigation right through to, you just talked about interpretation and quality of interpretation a few minutes ago. So how does the code apply to that? The system as a whole, the seamlessness, the communication between one side, one stage and the next right through the system?
Certainly by the code recognises that. So therefore regulating incident examination, that's from the initial collection, right through to interpretation. So it's always taken that holistic view. And it doesn't, as I've described, it doesn't limit itself to experts or the courts. I think it's also significant. Sometimes the pushback I get is, well, this is only about expert evidence. It doesn't affect me as a sort of frontline investigator. Well, it does. The Act is clear. It's about criminal investigations and proceedings. So determining whether a crime is committed is in scope. So even the initial actions by in a police force or an organisation at a crime scene, before they've even established the crime has been committed, is in scope for regulation. This is not. And I think that took some time for me to drive that point home. So therefore, and the enforcement, the investigation enforcement powers apply to that part of the process in the same way as they apply to expert evidence in the courts.
Thank you. Now, could I move to Dr. Bailey? Can you tell us what support or resources you have or would be needed to bring all forensic science practitioners into compliance?
This would be quite a difficult thing to achieve rapidly. Now, basically, this is a system based on risk. So if you're not in compliant, you have to declare what the risk is that the evidence that you're giving to the court is faulty. So my starting point is to improve those risk statements. They're not necessarily consistent and open to interpretation. So that bringing in place. The other thing to get in is the recognition that not everyone can achieve ISO accreditation. So we've already done some work on what can be done for the smaller FSPs, which aligns with ISO accreditation but isn't the full accreditation. And then effectively it's continuous reminders that it compliance. You can have compliance, and then due to, act of God, the police station burns down, you're out of compliance again. So you actually see a continuous turnover of hitting compliance. Overall, I'm seeing a lot of effort put in there because there's a strong culture of quality getting embedded now. So aside from my earlier answer about maybe have support for the FSR team, there's resources out there. It's just making sure they are adequate for what each organisation is trying to do.
I see. Anything from you, Mr. Gantley?
Thank you. I'd echo again the points that my colleagues here on this desk have highlighted. In terms of resource, it is always a challenge to make sure that we have sufficient resources in order to meet particular demand in terms of applications for accreditation. As I mentioned, the model of accreditation is self-financing. It's financed through the assessment fees that we charge to those accredited bodies. So we have to make sure that we have and plan ahead as long as possible to ensure we have the right internal resource and the right technical experts for any specific technical discipline. Some of the challenges and the opportunities that Marc had highlighted there in relation to ensuring greater compliance across all forensic science providers, large and small, from traditional disciplines into new and emerging areas, particularly in digital. That requires us to look very carefully at the model that operates at present, and one model doesn't apply in all different areas. And we've already started discussions about how we create milestones to compliance the primary objective is compliance with the code, and accreditation is a model that allows demonstration of that compliance. But working together, UKAS and the Forensic Science Regulator, we can create distinct and clear milestones that would take an organisation all the way to compliance with the code, and eventually then on to accreditation, and supporting that with free to access, free of charge webinars, training through a learning management system will help practitioners understand what they need, whether it's an individual practitioner, for example, on digital, accessing digital information, or it's an enterprise that's undertaking deep forensic analysis on digital devices.
Sorry to interrupt, but can they do that through these milestones and the gateway and so on without having to pay a fee?
Our model in accreditation is based upon assessment of efforts. We don't receive government funds for any of the work that we do.
No, but you said
so there will be.
Your survival is based on the fees, but I was wondering, are there steps that organisations might take before they have to pay a fee?
As much as possible, where we can develop materials and best practice guidance and develop training or webinars online, we would make sure that we're provided free of charge. But when it requires distinct professional expertise to go out and do an assessment activity, that's where there has to be a cost recovery model inherent within it. And our model is not to seek public funding for that.
But it might help them to prepare for the point where they go for full.
We already have through our portal self-assessment tools, which they can actually evaluate compliance against the relevant requirements and how they build to the code compliance. And the code is very detailed in setting out what the requirements are.
Thank you. When it comes to compliance, I'm afraid we must be mindful of the compliance of our own schedule, and we're running behind schedule. Lord Drayson.
So I want to take the questions to focus on whether or not the overall market is working, given that the government controls this market and determines whether sufficient resources are provided to enable your activities as regulators to be effectively complied with. So do you take into account, and particularly when consideration was being made on the process for implementation of these regulations, the impact on the practitioners and their ability to be able to afford to comply given the pricing that has been established for the provision of those services? I'm trying to get a sense as to whether or not the implementation of this regulatory regime to improve standards took place with an understanding that that would require additional financial resources to enable the market to continue to work. We've heard from other witnesses to this inquiry that forensic science is in crisis because so many practitioners have left because they have been unable to meet the regulatory requirements, and the funding that is provided to them to provide their services is inadequate for them to do so. Could you please give a sense as to whether you feel that crisis is taking place, and whether or not part of the reason for this is the level of resources being provided? Mr. Pugh.
I think my observation on that, forensic science regulation, which started some time ago, nearly 20 years ago now, and the model I've described about having an effective quality management system predates that. So this is 20 years in the making. So organisations who are going to undertake forensic science activities, this should not come as a surprise. It's also, I think, accepted that this is the way things should be done. So the costs of quality, the costs of providing accurate and reliable services, to me, have been very visible. And certainly my predecessor, who fought hard to get statutory powers, was frustrated because no one was progressing things as quickly as they should do. I think if you're going to do forensic science, you should do it to the appropriate standards.
Yeah, my question is not to question whether or not the standards should be implemented. They clearly should be. My question is whether or not the resources have been provided to enable people to meet those standards and to remain in this market.
My answer to that would be, well, if you're an organisation that's going to do this, you should secure the appropriate resources. And I say that because
Absolutely.
it's central. It's central to
Really looking for your sense as a regulator
yeah.
as to whether or not those resources have been provided. Is at the heart of the problem the lack of the resources to meet the recognised requirement to meet these regulatory standards?
I think there's certainly been an issue of organisations not realising that they need to take this seriously. And I would say what sometimes I think they do, they see accreditation as a badge. They chase the badge. They do this in a superficial way and they fail. Or they do it in a way that creates a management system that is far too complex.
Dr. Bailey, I'd be interested in your perspective on this. Is at the heart of this a funding problem or not?
It's a mixed answer. So about 3/4 of forensic science activities are delivered by the police. The police have a funding settlement from the government, but it's up to each individual force what level of resource they give to forensic sciences. I'm not aware of any force giving up over on forensic science overall. That would be a nonsense, given that you need forensic science even to collect evidence. But you do see them changing which forensic science activities they use. Some forces have partnered and distributed forensic science activities over that. That is probably reflected in the balance sheets of the police forces, but it's not reported on at the time. Looking at commercial providers, this committee has heard from the largest providers, which is Eurofins and KFS, which are large. They are, as you say, dominant in the market. They are actually very happy with the quality of systems.
We're concerned that might be a case of regulatory capture. That often happens in markets when there isn't sufficient thought given to the creation of a well-functioning market, particularly at the tail end, and you see the largest, most well-funded practitioners able to capture a dominant market share. Mr. Gantley, would you like to comment on that?
Actually just building on some of the points Gary Pugh has already made, is that those organisations that see quality assurance or accreditation as a badge are missing out on the huge opportunities for improving the scientific discipline and consistency and giving confidence to the market, and that ongoing continual improvement process that leads to that public confidence. So I think organisations that see it in that way miss that huge opportunity. But we are UKAS, and I know that the Forensic Science Regulator is very conscious of this, as not putting undue burden on forensic science providers. So the cost of accreditation is a self-finance model, as I've mentioned several times already. It's done on a not-for-profit basis. We don't have any shareholders. It's all, any small surplus we make is reinvested back into the business itself. And so the effort or the time that is taken to do an accreditation assessment is almost the minimum that we are able to do in order to do a rigorous assessment of that forensic science activity. We're very mindful of the impact that has, particularly on smaller niche areas, and so any increase in the cost of that accreditation is only done at the rate of inflation in order to make sure that we can cover our costs.
If I may come back, regulatory capture is a concern in any market for any regulator. I'm very aware of it. We use quite a large system. There's at no point does this regulator take any instructions from any one company. We consult widely, as widely as possible, on every level of expertise. We take into balance, but the code reflects a baseline structure to enable compliance by all organisations. And I will continue to be very vigilant for signs of regulatory capture, but I'm aware of none today.
You're aware of none today.
Yeah.
Are you concerned about the concentration that's taken place in the market over the last few years?
Concentration comes in, but the concentration is... It also effectively looks like market dynamics as well. If the companies kind of seem to operate in the structure where they can merge and so forth, and that's created large providers, but they're not necessarily larger than the police forces. If you remember, there are still only about a quarter of the total number of providers. So would I say that they're in a position to dominate? No. Has they got freedom to still grow? probably yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Lord Buckley.
Thank you, Chair. Just following on the last discussion, I mean, we've heard a lot of evidence from people that it's regulatory capture that may include part of it, but the process is time-consuming and burdensome, and the police complain that it takes away from their normal work. One could say, well, they would say that, wouldn't they? And there's also evidence that some of the external providers may be reluctant to join the market because of the costs of doing it. And so, is it true that, I mean, the comment that your charges are extortionate is a pretty strong criticism. And is there any other way that the process can be looked at? And in particular, is there a different way that the smaller providers can, a shortcut is not the right word, but if you understand what I'm trying to get at, in other words, there's no point in them leaving and no longer being part of the system if it's just because of cost. And is it therefore, I don't know, would it be, the niche providers don't obviously, perhaps they don't get asked to do the work quite so often, but they're still needed, aren't they? And they still need accreditation. So what can you do about that to try and make it more accessible without everybody moaning all the time? I know regulatory capture is a well-known criticism covering many regulators, but this one is quite a strong criticism we've heard. Marc.
Thank you. First of all, we're not a regulator in that sense, but what we do is we evaluate against the code and accreditation requirements, award accreditation based upon that evaluation, and that's obviously taken in consideration by the regulator in terms of evaluation of overall compliance. When we look at our fees, we ensure that we evaluate or determine what is required in order to undertake a rigorous assessment of the forensic science provider, whatever discipline that might be, from digital forensics to aspects of toxicology. So it is a risk-based approach to ensuring that we undertake sufficient time on site with that forensic science regulator, or looking at or provider, or looking at their systems remotely. So we have to build in the time, and that's the time that is the chargeable element of our work. And so we recover the cost of that by charging for those fees. We're very mindful of the impact that has, particularly on smaller enterprises. But we have to strike a balance, and this affects everything that we do, from the work we do in accrediting NHS pathology laboratories to the work that we do in evaluating the potability of water and water testing. The many bodies that we accredit are public organisations, such as the NHS pathology laboratories, and we need to, wherever possible, minimise the cost impact on the public service. So that's why we're very cautious of if fees go up because of inflation, we do that to the minimum level possible to cover those increased costs that we will see as an organisation. But we are not for profit in the way that we operate. So what we have to balance is, if there's a very large organisation such as Eurofins that may undertake a niche activity, for example, it could be digital forensics, and then there's a very small organisation that does the same activity, we can't give one a subsidy and the other not a subsidy. So we have to be very careful, and the fee rate is standardised for everyone. Nevertheless, we realise the impact, particularly on smaller enterprises coming into the market, and that's why, working with the Forensic Science Regulator, we're now developing a programme of milestones approach to achieving compliance with the code and then getting to accreditation. And we think that will be actually universally welcomed by big and small organisations, but helping them to understand the systems and processes and practices that were needed in order to achieve compliance. And that will be done at the self-assessment modules, or the training will be done on a free-to-access basis.
Do you have any, Dr. Bailey, do you want to have anything to add?
We don't collect costs at the moment, but what we do look at is understanding the burden of regulation. So I've at the moment engaged with the NPCC and other bodies to start collecting evidence. A lot of these complaints you've heard is anecdotal, and I'm struggling to find really robust evidence, partly because people define the word burden in so many different ways. So to try and get a consistency of what is happening is work that I am undertaking. When I identify it, there's probably multiple drivers. It's a case of over-engineering a solution, or given that this is a risk-based structure, inappropriate response to risk. And so I've got discussions with forces about how we can advise on their own process reviews to make sure that we are removing inappropriate work. And I hope that in time we will then have figures that can actually back up these anecdotes.
Would it help if there were less than 43 police forces to deal with?
The 43 police force structure, I must admit, does create duplication, but then there's a fair amount of local need as well.
Of course.
Which drives it. So I'm not sure that would be a quick solution.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. I mean, if I can just very briefly, Mr. Gantley, the Westminster Commission report, which we have taken into account in this inquiry, does refer, forgive me if I use these quotes, that the accreditation process was, quote, over-engineered, disproportionate, overly arduous, serving to stifle disciplines and destabilising the market. Now, do you think those are fair criticisms, or is there anything you'd like to tell us to counter it while we have today's hearing?
The UKAS accreditation process is a rigorous process, and we have to define the requirement to evaluate thoroughly the compliance of the forensic science provider in delivering against the code or the international requirements set out in the accreditation standards. So we have to be rigorous in being able to do that. So we do that on an initial assessment and then on a surveillance basis. So it has to be rigorous. The systems that the forensic science provider puts in place are their choice to develop their own quality management systems. If they've developed bureaucratic, burdensome systems, that would have been their choice to be able to choose that. We don't tell them what systems to put into place. They choose the methodology of demonstrating compliance. In terms of the cost of accreditation, so the smallest provider that we have under accreditation, their assessment days per annum is around 5 days. And that translates to an overall annual cost of around £6,000 per annum. The mode, or the most frequent cost of accreditation, is in terms of assessment days is around 15 days, and that translates to around £20,000 in cost. So remember, that's done at a cost recovery self-financing basis. I don't see that as extortionate costs.
Thank you very much. Lord Stern.
Could I ask the in-house version of that question, because most of the forensic services are provided within the police service, and most of that is not accredited, particularly in the digital area, but more broadly. So if most of the work is done by people who are not accredited, as it clearly is, does that suggest that the accreditation system is not fit for purpose?
No, it's that they haven't yet demonstrated their ability to meet the requirements of the code or the accreditation requirements.
If you're trying to accredit and, in that sense, give quality standards, and most of the activity does not meet those standards, is that tell us something about the relationship between the accreditation and the people you're trying to work with? How can you bridge that gap? I mean, something's not working, right?
I agree. We need to bridge the gap and all work together to make sure that the system operates effectively. And I've already highlighted some of the initiatives that we've put into place in terms of the training, the free-to-access webinars that we've provided, the self-evaluation tools in our digital platform where the forensic science providers can go in and evaluate compliance against the relevant requirements of the code or the accreditation requirements. All of that is free to access for them to demonstrate and evaluate the compliance against the code, and then move towards accreditation when they're ready to be able to do that.
But the gap's so big. I mean, is there any sign of them doing it anytime soon?
So what we've also been doing with the forensic science regulators is focusing on what are the critical aspects of compliance against the code that are the immediate priority for any particular disciplines, for example, incident scene examination, and focusing on those first in terms of a process of milestones towards full compliance and then achieving accreditation.
There's still a very long way to go, it seems, in terms of how few of them are accredited.
Code compliance is critical to ensuring scientific discipline and the rigour of the forensic science activity.
Those two want to come in.
Could I, in the interest of time, because my next question is for you, Marc Bailey. So please pick up your reaction, what you're going to say in this one too. You talked about trying to understand the burden of regulation, and it's always a difficult issue wherever you look, because it's so difficult to define. But let me give a different version of that question, which it's not the same thing, but it is along the lines you were describing. If you think about the regulation and structure that's there, and it's there for a good reason, and you think about the difficulty of complying and the relationship of resources to that difficulty of complying, are you aware of any studies, or are you initiating studies along the lines you began to describe, on what sort of resources are necessary to meet the compliance standards that one is looking for? So it's not quite the same as the burden of regulation. You're saying, given the standards that are being imposed, and understandably so, what resources do they actually need to comply with those standards?
Certainly. Can I
and please pick up any comments you would have wished to make.
If I can start by picking up and then coming to that. So the statutory powers request that any practitioner is compliant with the code. The code is a risk-based structure, and so the final result coming out from the forensic evidence should be coming out with a risk statement. So if you are completely beginning, you don't have the equipment, there's a very high risk that you have produced invalid results.
Clearly any definition of compliance is associated with a degree of risk. I think we have to take that as understood.
Oh, absolutely, but the compliance set out in the code are effectively a set of performance criteria, and your risk statement is whether you've missed that performance criteria. Now, coming to the second half of the question, well, what's the resources for that? As you'd expect, it's highly variable depending on which FSA. By and large, the forensic science activities have a strong scientific component. So that at the highest level, Gary mentioned 3 levels from frontline to scientist, you do need a qualified scientist to understand and interpret. That reflects a level of investment, because such scientists have to be trained, they have to have proficiency, they have to have understanding. But those costs will still vary by scientific discipline. Further down in the FSAs, you can start to actually approach straightforward where proficiency can be done with people with lower level of training to the front line. But that has to be assessed as a whole for any one FSA. It's very hard to give you an absolute answer. It reflects two. It's the practitioners and what they feed back and what they're seeing, and the experts saying what is needed to hit that overall judgment of risk, and then understanding if the balance is in the right place.
Is there any, thank you very much for that, is there any interaction between you and the police forces, because I'm focusing on in-house because that's where the majority is happening, do they say or give you any idea, or are there any studies of what extra resources they would need to be fully compliant, taking into account that any notion of fully compliant comes with a risk?
I haven't received as yet in my role a resource breakdown. I have had various forces promising such, which we'll see if comes in. So the communication is there. I meet monthly with the head of quality on the NPCC, Chief Constable Paul Gibson. I meet much more regularly with the quality board. We discuss all aspects of the quality provision. It's trying to get beyond the anecdote in that to get to the resource. And yes, we need more information to really understand, to give you a proper answer to your question.
So that's resource spent, we don't really know, and resource needed, we don't really know either to meet.
Resource spent, I don't have access to the figures. They're presumably within police budgets, practitioners' budgets. Anticipating the access, it should come into the part of what is the FSA and how it's changed. And as we've mentioned, there are FSAs changing where they want to actually deliver with less trained staff. So something like evidence collection, so making sure that the cost changes. It goes from salary of an expert to actually training costs for a large number of officers. There's still costs.
Thank you.
Yes, of course.
Sorry, but I realise you're running over. I'll just make a few points listening to that. Firstly, in terms of commercial organisations coming into the market, when I did the review of the drugs driving company, what I did see was that they had not appreciated the rigour of the criminal justice system. This is a perfectly reputable company doing toxicology analysis. They hit the criminal justice system and they just didn't realise the scrutiny they would get with their results. I think my view was, as a regulator, we could do something about that by helping new entrants understand the regulatory framework before they make the investment and start providing services. The second one, I've heard it said that most of forensic science is insourced. Well, it's not. I've just done a rough calculation. If you look at the 36 FSAs now at the subject of the code, 7 are undertaken by the police only, 10 are undertaken by both police and commercial, and 19 are undertaken by the private sector only. So this is not, the insourcing has been happening, and that raises a whole set of other issues. But at the moment, we have a predominantly, and I think certainly most of the complex forensic science activities take place in the commercial sector.
Well, that's different. On the digital side, we've heard that almost none of really most of that is done in-house.
Yes, for digital, there are, as I said earlier, I think there are at least probably 60 organisations.
I'm not talking about the number of organisations, I'm talking about the level of activity, that most of the digital is done in-house.
Yes, and I think that reflects you've got more frontline recovery of data that wouldn't be done by the specialist units in police forces or their commercial providers. So it's a very different model. It's the fact that digital is so ubiquitous, digital recovery.
But if we're talking about the level of resources and the level of activity, it's important to recognise that the big majority is in-house, right? It's not simply counting the number of suppliers.
No, it's the amount, if you like, of the activity that's undertaken as well. But and again, the annual report gives you some information on that. But I wouldn't like to think that there's a lot of forensic science that is still done outside of the police environment. That's not to say the police don't have ambitions to insource that, but at the moment the situation...
No, it's a matter of fact that the big majority of activity is in-house, right?
I don't think so, because all of the DNA, the large volume activity, DNA profiling, toxicology, is done by commercial companies. There is large volume activity in terms of fingerprints and digital done in-house. I don't think it's the police service are dominant in the sense at the moment.
We've had evidence
in the volume. And could I also, I'll own up in the sense of something as well that's mentioned about concerns about the burden of regulation. And there was particular concerns, in fact they were raised with the Home Secretary in my time, about crime scene examination. And in the interest of time, basically, I set out to fix that. I think that regulation was ineffective. The code is written from a laboratory perspective. What we were seeing was the culture of a laboratory. So we were trying to treat a crime scene as a laboratory, and that just wasn't the right thing to do. So I took action in version 2 of the code. And I think the key to this, to go back, if you like, to the beginning, the code did not have specific requirements for scene examination. So we've introduced those into version 2 of the code and suspended the requirement for accreditation for a period to allow, well, it'll be predominantly police organisations, to adjust, to adopt a more proportionate approach, but still meet the relevant standards and requirements that are in the code.
Thank you very much. Baroness Young.
Our 2019 report and the Westminster Commission report talked about having somebody looking at the whole of the forensic science market more broadly, rather than simply having a regulator regulating whoever happened to be in the market at the time. I mean, where do you stand on that? Do you want to? I mean, perhaps I can ask Dr. Bailey, because that he's got the reins at the moment. Do you want to become the regulator of the whole market, and what would that entail? What additional powers and resources would you need?
It's not something that the Act currently defines. So, and it's not something that I've personally investigated. There are examples of regulators who regulate markets, and if that was a route to go down, I would ask for basically commission a report to understand what the powers are. So I can't answer that question. Gary has made the earlier point. This is an unusual market. When you join it, you have to produce to the rigour both of the policing and the criminal justice system. You have to retain evidence for many years so that people can go back to it. You have to retain records. These all drive up costs. So I think any market has got a high barrier to entry because of it, and that makes the regulation the market is going to be somewhat less fluid because of the barrier to entry. But that doesn't mean examples of that exist. I would say that within it there are things that can be done within the regulatory framework to improve confidence of those who are in the market already, to understand how well they're performing as vendors. But I would say that it needs more work to understand if the forensic science regulator role is in the right position to fully control the access of commercial providers to the forensic science market.
I mean, I've seen examples of regulators who don't necessarily have market regulation in their establishing statute, but nevertheless see the stability of the market and the propensity of it to produce higher quality or lower quality as a fundamental part of their regulatory role. You don't see that.
Sorry if I gave that impression. I'm very much keen on driving up quality as high as possible for all practitioners, but I don't segregate the code by size of organisation. We attempt to have an even-handed code.
My experience in the regulating health and social care was that if you didn't keep an eye on the market, the quality of an organisation that had 800 old dears in its beds was not going to be very high if it had just gone bust. But perhaps we can move on from there. So if you don't see it necessarily as something that's an immediate priority for the regulator, who should be keeping an eye on the market? We've now got this new post in the Home Office, the Director of Forensic Science. Is that where it should lie, or?
The Director of Forensic Science is recently in post, so this is my understanding of the role rather than what perhaps the role is that that person is looking to understand how the services are delivered and come up with a structure that is more effective for policing. That, as a very broad remit, will have to include both the policing and the commercial providers. And so that role probably creates a new market structure at the end of the day. Now, if you're creating a market, that doesn't necessarily mean you're best to regulate the market. So it may mean that you do need to have an additional regulatory function to call both the creator and the market to account. Now, whether that comes onto this statutory role or it may be perceived as better to be by a new statutory organisation of some kind. Really depends on what the solution is. At present, we try to make sure that the code can be applied regardless of size of the FSP, and so we do make some allowances and that in the code in terms of rigour of number of steps they need for compliance. So, for instance, for sole providers, we've introduced peer review to make sure that there's an independent quality measure come through. We recognise not everybody can be accredited, but we should still drive everybody for the highest level of excellence in quality.
Could I ask both our regulators, one can never have too many regulators in my view, how you're feeling at the moment on a personal basis about the balance between in-house and commercial services? I mean, is it a healthy balance at the moment? Is the direction of travel, which seems to be more stuff coming in-house, healthy, or would you ideally want to see a much more diverse market?
I think firstly, as Marc says, and I'm drawing now on my experience, having been, just declare it, I was Director of Forensic Services in the Metropolitan Police, so I actually ran the largest forensic unit for 17 years. Prior to that, I was in the Forensic Science Service, so I was in, and the Home Office Service for that, and I was a director in that organisation as well. So I've seen this market go from the very early days when it was really just seen, well, not a market really, but it was a change of funding mechanism to allow what was then the FSS to increase its resources to meet the demands from the police. So I think we've got into, this is by accident rather than design, and I think before we regulate the market we need to decide what we want it to do. It's a constrained, disjointed system at the moment, and we've seen the risks, we've seen companies come and go, and that can have major consequences. As Marc highlights, if you're going to be a provider in this area, and again, if you sort of follow the Westminster Commission view, you could have companies coming in and out of this market, but if they leave, where do people go for the evidence that the CCRC need 5-10 years after the event? We have to have some careful thought as to what purpose the market serves. In terms of the balance between police and the commercial sector, and I say I've been part of this, I think that what we seem to have lacked at the centre is thought about how this should operate in practice. And what the police service have done, and I own up I did this, is they've ended up being provider and buyer. And I think that means you've got inevitable conflicts with no kind of, no independent assessment of what the right solution is. So I think we will drift to more insourcing, particularly as there is at the moment. There is no control in the sense of, a chief constable can just set up a forensic laboratory and start doing forensic science. If they meet the requirements of the code, that's fine. All of that funding and investment decisions, there's no scrutiny of that. So I think I would start from foot on the ball. Let's look and see what is actually going on here.
And the new, I mean, you talk. Well, there was talk about the Director of Forensic Services in their new work, perhaps reshaping the markets. What about MOJ? Should they be involved?
Good question. I mean, the MOJ, I'm not aware of any statements, but of course the courts are the ultimate arbiter of forensic science. They pick what evidence goes into the courts. They understand the emphasis on it. So I feel that's very much a question for MOJ, but you can see there's a source of information there which would be useful.
Do you think there's enough of a handshake between MOJ and the Home Office on forensic science?
It's interesting. I actually got the framework document I referred to, positions the Regulator having a line into the Justice Secretary. That took some persuading. I think that the way this is seen is that certainly my role was under the Policing Minister. Yeah. And I think, forensic science is the Home Office's problem, not the MOJ problem. That's the firm impression I get. Having said that, I've worked closely with people in the MOJ, and I think that they need to be more of a party to this in terms of what the future holds for forensic science. And one of the things which I mentioned earlier on about defence sector, I think that it is unregulated. There are no barriers to entry. There are some real issues around capacity and capability. I raised those concerns with the Minister, and I also tried to get the review of that part of forensic science into the reform programme. But of course it's not about policing. So it was, it didn't work, and the remit of the new Director of Forensic Services, my understanding, won't look at that aspect of forensic science, which I think is critically important and is a significant risk.
I'm sorry that we must make progress because we are overrunning. Lord Ranger.
I think, look, gentlemen, thank you very much. Very enlightening hearing from you and different views from what we've heard from previous witnesses. And I'm taken by some of the comments, particularly Dr. Bailey, about your setting up of the IT portal for the first time this year. Mr. Pugh, your points about competency of every detective around data recovery. And as someone who's very new, in fact, completely new to this area, I didn't know anything about it before we started this inquiry, the world of forensic science and then the world of digital forensics is very interesting to me. I come from an IT sector background. And to be honest, the whole world is becoming digital. So I wonder where these two worlds blend, and you still, and many people talk to them about quite separately, but effectively there's a lot of technology that will probably is involved at the moment and will be ever more so. So the question is, how are you, at the moment, if you're just coming into just getting a portal going and basic things happening, and we have this fragmented landscape, 43 different forces, etc., how are you able to keep up with the developments that are potentially emerging in digital forensics? I must disclose, particularly in relevant to this question, I'm a co-founder of the Business AI Alliance, which is a community of startup AI businesses in the UK. So I will ask, AI is going to play a big part in what you're doing. Are you reaching out to that type of sector to help you in terms of what you might be developing or need for requirements in digital forensics? And then how does that enable you, or how will that move into the setting of standards and codes and accreditation going forward? Maybe if I could start with you, Dr. Bailey.
Absolutely. So, as I mentioned earlier, the Forensic Science Regulator gets advice from expert groups. And there's no doubt that digital is growing enormously. But what we're seeing from discussion of police forces is that if you go back 10 years, it wasn't considered. Now, one of their first actions to seize the routers and the phones at a site and consider that evidence right from the start. So you have a system which is taking on and learning quite rapidly. I'm bringing together expert groups so we understand where the priorities are, absolutely what's needed to make this forensic evidence rather than a general discussion of AI. There are multiple regulators grappling with how to regulate the expansion of digital information and AI. And I don't intend to reinvent the wheel. I will happily borrow what is good practice from multiple regulators. I'm looking to understand really what is compelling for the criminal justice system, what is the controlled risk. The police absolutely feel they're in an arms race between them and the development of the digital world, and I don't wish to get into that in a way of that. So we're looking at best practice. Now, today, there's already FSAs that use complex algorithms, complex IT. So, for instance, the DNA analysis uses a significant amount of IT to get the information. So again, rather than put something new in, it's take that. The code today is structured around how you collect the evidence. It doesn't prescribe what to do with a mobile phone. That's the operating procedures of the police. It just says, well, this is how the information could be structured. But I am very aware that there will be other issues evolving, and looking to get input from the police to develop as rapidly as possible.
Mr. Pugh.
I think Matt has got something to say about AI. The only thing I would say is, having looked at this, we regulate human intelligence in people comparing finger marks, which is a cognitive process. We've developed in forensic science globally validation systems, which I think are quite robust. Again, we'll see how they fare with AI. But I think we're prepared for it in that sense, because we're always looking to validate a method to understand and manage the risk of error. So I think we'll come to it with that. And I'm not saying it's not going to be challenging, but we'll come to it with the right mindset.
Just before I come to you, Mr. Gantley, Dr. Bailey, on your point, it's really good to hear you're working with the other regulators. I might ask if you're working with the Information Commissioner's Office, because they're doing a lot about processing and bringing that view together. But also, it's less about the AI, it's more about the outcomes you're trying to achieve. And I definitely see an opportunity of where you could bring some of the thinking that's happening in that world into how you are working at the moment, to see how the processes and even what is done can be done differently in the future with agentic AI and various other things. But that's something we consider.
Absolutely happy to, but we need to control the uncertainty throughout of it. So we need to understand where the risks are of any of that such move.
Thank you. Again, building on what my counterparts here have highlighted, so AI has the opportunity and actually the challenge to transform the way in which conformity assessment works right across testing, inspection, certification, validation and verification. Everything that we accredit, everything that goes on, from the food that we eat to the air that we breathe, is tested, inspected or certified in some shape or form. And AI in all industries will have a transformational impact. And so in order to provide guidance or a framework for conformity assessment bodies that we accredit, in June this year we produced a technical bulletin which set out guidance for how laboratories or inspection bodies or certification bodies should look to develop, to test, to validate and deploy artificial intelligence in the future. We also created a body called the AIQI Consortium. We did that with the Testing, Inspection and Certification Council, and that is a body of standards development organisations, metrology organisations, policy development organisations, accreditation and conformity assessment bodies, to work together on creating the solutions for conformity assessment. Forensics is just one aspect of that. So we've already published a technical bulletin. We're working with our international counterparts. In Germany, they're now translating that into German, and that will be produced in English and German. So there's consistency between the UK and Germany on the use of AI for conformity assessment, and there'll be use cases that will go behind it. We've also produced a series of training materials free to access through the UKAS learning management system. And we are working through a process of creating an assurance framework of saying, if you are a regulator or a user of conformity assessment, or if you have a product or service, how do you navigate this landscape of the EU AI Act or the UK's regulations or the US regulations to understand what form of conformity assessment you'll need. So it's a huge amount of work, because it is, as I've said, transformation for all industries and for accreditation and conformity assessment. So especially for digital forensics, it will have a huge impact. And so we'll, as I mentioned already, work with the Forensic Science Regulator to produce appropriate guidance and information to how it should be developed, tested, validated and deployed in practice. If we want to be pro-innovation, we've got to make sure we do that in the right way.
Well, that's great to hear. And I think, just coming back to a point, Mr. Pugh, that you made about, the sort of ability for any chief constable to set up a lab and go, and no barriers to entry, maybe the development and deployment of the technology, which will be hopefully beneficial, can help both in establishing some barriers in terms of quality barriers, but also maybe helping standardise. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. We're nearly at the end. Lord Borwick.
Thank you. It's still relatively early on for the FSR's statutory powers. How do you think we should measure the success of this regime? And how would you measure what is the criterion of failure? What would failure look like?
It is an interesting question. I suppose failure is going to be a succession of cases that fail due to a particular forensic science activity having failed to deliver evidence. because that failure would be...
Killer forensic failures or generalised?
I'm about to put forward a general model of what it looks like, because in the case of that forensic science activity, that was delivered through the police reviewed it, submitted to the case, the CPS reviewed it, and it still failed in court, not once, but time and time again. I think that's what a systematic failure looks like. And we would have to address that. As Gary mentioned earlier, the defence plays a key role in understanding that last ditch. I'm trying to make sure that we see the minimal of invalid forensic evidence making it to the criminal justice system in the first place. So that would be a view of failure. Successes is effectively, we've mentioned this, we're seeing the response of police forces to bringing in compliance and the law in terms of additional training. Gary mentioned 70,000 staff having been trained in digital evidence. We've just recounted that, and it's now 120,000. So you can see changes in practice. If I can pick another example, I'd like to raise sexual assault referral centres, referred to as SARCs. Now that is a significant part of any sexual assault case, is getting the forensic evidence. And this has to be done on a person who has been traumatised and is in a difficult place. So these centres, there are now 52 coming into line. There they involve huge victim support and as compassionate as possible collection of evidence, so not to really add to the grievance, add to the injury. And this has been an unprecedented collaboration between the Forensic Science Regulator and the medical establishment to make sure we have the right standards, the right approach. It's been inspiring.
Well, thank you very much. Now, last but by no means least, Baroness Neville-Jones.
Thank you, Chairman. Your responses to that question may be relevant to the one I'm going to ask you. As you'll be aware, the committee, after it's taken all its evidence, will write a report in which we'll be making recommendations to the government, most particularly of the attention of the Home Office and the Ministry of Justice. And what we'd like to ask you is, if you had the opportunity to make such recommendations, where would you like to put the emphasis, addressing in particular, if you would, the issues of funding, capacity, and equality of arms between, obviously, defence and prosecution. So my question to you is, each of you, what would be your top recommendation that you really want to think would be something that really did help push things forward? And bearing in mind also the fact that the market is to some extent changing with the advent of the digital world, which I think you would agree is going to take up more and more, it seems to me, of the provision that's going to be needed. Mr. Pugh, would you like to start?
Yes, if I could just mention perhaps some parochial things, but in the review I did of the legislation and looking at there are two things which I really do want to highlight to you. The first is the way the Act is written, regulation only applies to organisations in England and Wales. So an organisation in Scotland, Northern Ireland or anywhere else in the world who undertakes a forensic science activity is outside of the remit of the regulator. I can understand that I don't regulate Scotland, Northern Ireland. I need to make that very clear, having talked to those administrations. But I think the way it's written is perhaps not what was intended. And I can think of examples I dealt with where I could not take action against individuals who were giving evidence in England and Wales, but because they weren't based in England and Wales, they are outside my remit. The second one, parochial point, is Crown bodies who are exempt from investigation and enforcement, which interestingly includes the National Crime Agency as an arm's length body of the Home Office and immigration enforcement. both of whom are not compliant with the code. So I think those are two issues to address. To come to your funding capacity, I mean, I'll be brief. I mean, funding, I think my recommendation, we need to understand it to start with. I mean, I've not seen any data, certainly in my time, going throughout my career. We do not understand what's being spent on forensic science or the investment decisions that are being made. Capacity, I think, I would look at that by, perhaps I would say this, but by forensic science activity, because and I would look at capability and performance as well. The forensic science activity definitions I think they might extend to actually analysing and looking at forensic science in the round. And then finally, equality of arms. I'll be slightly radical, if slightly off the wall. There is a real issue with the defence sector, and this is very tongue-in-cheek. I wonder whether all of the forensic staff within the police service should be able to work for the defence.
Thank you. Dr. Bailey.
I must echo some of Gary's points.
Probably not the last one.
Possibly not the last one, but particularly the concern about the geographic remit of England and Wales.
Right.
What we're seeing with digital...
But you think it's anomalous, or do you want England and Wales to move in the Scottish direction?
No, that wasn't my point. I was thinking more about digital evidence. Increasingly, as we see the use of AI, we of course see using the cloud. I'd like to make sure it's unambiguous that cloud data, especially held in other geographic regions, are subject to the code, and so you're not seeing digital evidence becoming invalid because of that. So an extension of the powers. I support the Crown Body's statement as well. I would really encourage the criminal justice system to share, not as in we'll move everybody into defence, but absolutely a much more structured exchange of information will enable me to understand how forensic science quality is working, and effectively not where you need to increase quality and where you could possibly hit the right level or even overextend it. As I've mentioned, I'd like to make possibly more formal recognition of the surveillance powers, such as the visits, so that people are aware that the regulator is not just sitting in London, but is actually there to both support and understand what's going on throughout. I also am interested to see there's been a public consultation launched on biometrics, which is an interesting area, highly important to policing. Yeah. There's discussions there about the alignment of forensic science with other regulators. I absolutely endorse the need for consultation and making sure that biometrics is used appropriately. I just hope that it doesn't inadvertently damage the progress we've made to date on building the forensic science regulatory system.
Thank you.
Thank you. I would set out three key areas of recommendations for the future, particularly as it relates to accreditation and compliance with the code. First of all, is for earlier interventions into the process, supporting those forensic science providers to go through that journey towards accreditation through the process of code compliance. And that's focused on a series of milestones supported with relevant best practice, with support from relevant webinars, self-evaluation tools, a whole suite of tools that are there to be able to support the forensic science provider, whether they're small or large, to reach compliance as soon as possible. And secondly, a distinct and very clear requirement to achieve compliance, whether that is through the declarations given as part of the criminal prosecution system, but also very clear commitment to code compliance and reaching accreditation, so that that process can be properly managed in terms of resources. And lastly, to continue on the process of a continual improvement culture. And that comes from the points that Gary's already said in terms of ensuring there's a clear understanding of data, clear KPIs on success of managing risk, and also that process of quality incidents being reported up and escalated at the earliest possible opportunity, so we can analyse and understand where the key issues are, especially in emerging areas of digital forensics or new developed areas of sexual assault referral centres, for example.
Well, look, thank you very much indeed for coming, for answering all the questions. You've raised some interesting issues right up to including the end. And we'd like to thank you very much indeed for joining us today. You've set us up very nicely for what will be our next public session with ministers from both the Home Office and the Ministry of Justice. But for now, that concludes the session of the committee.